Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse. So today I've got a very timely interview for you with Dr. Charles Nenner, someone who is really revered in the financial cycles industry and someone that really understands how cycles, which really is the rise and fall, and he's going to explain what the cycles are, but what they will show us about where we're at in history, what to expect next, and really looking at what's coming here in the next, say, 10 years or so. And so what's interesting is that this is an interview that I did last week before all of the Silicon Valley Bank stuff, but we're talking about where he expects the stock market to head and what's happening with the dollar and the currencies and everything. So it's interesting being able to give this interview to you this week following all of this insanity, because a lot of what Charles talked about in this interview is really setting up the stage for what we're seeing happening right now. But I think that he really helps understand where things are probably headed in the future and has some solutions as well. So I hope you enjoy this. Make sure you're following me, folks, on social media at Man in America. You can also watch the show on LFA TV over on Rumble if you want to check them out. They've got some great hosts as well. And every show is also put out as a podcast. So if you want to listen instead of watch, just go to your favorite podcast app, search for Man in America. You'll see my smiling face. There you go. Subscribe. All right, folks, let's dive into this interview with Dr. Charles Nenner. Dr. Nenner, it is an honor to have you on the show. Thank you for being here with us today.
Welcome. Let's see what we're going to talk about.
Absolutely. So I've heard you multiple times in your interviews with Greg Hunter over at USA Watchdog, and I've always been intrigued. And I think it was either you or Martin Armstrong where I first got the understanding of these cycles. And it was really quite amazing to me to enter into that world of looking at how things are working through the lens of cycles and how these cycles can be used to not only make sense of where we're at right now, but also to predict where things are going and everything. So before we jump into the details of what you're seeing and what you're kind of expecting over the next, say, decade or so, can you just help explain to the audience what these cycles are and how you're able to kind of pull the data from them?
Yes. So the first thing we have to assume that things don't move at random, because if things move at random, then you cannot predict anything. So let's say for thousands of years, the apple fell from the tree until Newton say, hey, maybe there's something underlying, and he came out with a theory. Now, if you assume that everything happens at random, you don't have to look for anything because you don't know. And that's always my question to people, then how do you invest in financial markets? So we have to start with the point of view that things don't move at random. And now we're going to look if we can find how they perform and what they do if they don't move at random. So when I was a medical doctor, I was involved in worldwide research if people became psychotic at certain periods and if there were regular periods, because we, for instance, knew that women give early birth when it's full moon. And there's a cycle, but we don't know why, but you better have your staff ready because there's an influx of women. Which brings me to the point that since I'm a medical doctor, I don't have to understand everything. I just have to know what happens. An economist always wants to know first what happens before he uses it. The big discussion I had all the years I was at Goldman Sachs, they're all economists, and as long as they don't understand it, they don't use the data the right way. And I don't care. I said, I'm a doctor. If the red pill is going to save you, I don't have to know what's in the red pill. I'm going to give you the red pill. So it's a very practical attitude. So we found out that in certain intervals all over the world, more people became psychotic than normal. And then I was on vacation in the United States and I saw a program, CNBC, and they said the market was up and down. It says, well, they don't say very much. Let me look into it. Maybe the same system is working that way, which it did. And in the 80s, I had to do everything by hand, but later the computers came out, and that really helped. So what we found out is that markets go up and down in a certain interval. Now, you can have yearly intervals, and within the yearly interval, you can have monthly intervals, daily, and we do even intraday updates. So we can say, At 9:15, an S&P will go up. How many points it will go up? I get to that in a minute. And how many hours it will go up, based on the fact that it's based on emotions, because you will say, how do you know what the news is that can come out? So I will give you an example. Let's say you and I own IBM and we bought it at 100. It's trading at 150, which is great. Now IBM comes out with a great quarterly result. The question is, does IBM go up or down? Well, that depends on the cycles. If the cycle is up, IBM goes up, and the Wall Street Journal will write, investors poured into IBM because it did great. But now if the cycle is down, IBM has to go down, but the news is still great. So now IBM goes down, and what will the Wall Street Journal write? People took profit because they don't think IBM will do better next quarter. Which means is, even if you know the news, if you don't know the interpretation of the news, it doesn't even help you. Now, the interpretation of the news is based on mass psychology, which is the basis for the cycles. Now, there is a component, a physical component to cycles. Don't want to make it too complicated, but I did studies on the sunspot intensity. And the sunspot intensity creates a magnetic field down here on Earth and influences the crystallization of water. And since we have about 80% water in the brain, it influences the water in the brain, which influences, without us being aware, how we decide on certain things. So there is a physical component to all these cycles. So it has been done. I finished the work like in the middle of 85. Since then, I didn't have to change anything. So now we have, first of all, a cycle program that can tell you up to the exact day, exact week, exact year, in bonds, in currencies, in gold, silver, S&P, NASDAQ, whatever you do, if it goes up or down, and how many days it goes up and how many days it goes down. On top of that, we found out that if something goes up with a certain momentum, now we go back to school again, that you probably learned that if you shoot a bullet in the air, you can calculate, if you know the momentum, how high it goes and how long it stays in the air until it goes down. So we found out the same formula for the financial markets. Something goes up with a certain momentum, and then you can calculate in advance how far it will go. So now we know how far it will go, which we call price targets, and we know the date when it's going to be there. And this makes an academic study out of investing, takes away all the emotions. And in a short talk here, that's what we do.
Folks, I have a quick message for you. Look, I've been talking about these topics for quite some time, but it's really getting much more serious. The reality is that our financial systems are changing. They want to push us into the central bank digital currency. They want the dollar to collapse. China and Russia are trying to actively de-dollarize the world. And unfortunately, look, if our life savings, if our assets are sitting in items like IRAs, 401ks, or even a large bank account, those are all vulnerable because they're tied to the dollar. Whereas if you have gold and silver, the gold, for instance, has been already tied to the Russian ruble. So it's going to create more stability, not to mention what happens if the gold standard comes back in certain countries. We're going to see a continuing strengthening in gold and silver. And so if you want to protect your financial future, folks, I highly recommend moving at least a portion of your wealth into physical gold and silver. It's really what's going to keep us protected and keep our wealth sustained so we can really survive whatever they throw at us, because they're trying to ruin us. They really are. And I'm sure you can see that. And so to do this, look, if you have your own person you're working with that you already buy the gold and silver from, great. I'm very happy for you. But if you don't, and you're looking for somebody you can trust, I highly recommend Dr. Kirk Elliott. So Dr. Kirk Elliott is an amazing Christian patriot, and he helps people like you protect their financial future. And he's an expert in understanding gold and silver and the best ways to put your assets into gold and silver. They also specialize in IRA transfers, where you can transfer your IRA into physical gold and silver that you own with zero taxes or penalties. So to learn more about this, go right now in a new tab and visit goldwithseth.com, or you can call 720-605-3900. Again, That's 720-605-3900 or goldwithseth.com. Folks, don't wait. Just get this started today. You'll be appreciative in the future because as you'll see in this interview, things don't look so good for the stock market. It's very amazing. And, I've studied a lot of Eastern culture, and the way that they look at things in the East is through cycles. In the West, it seems like that we're naturally just more linear. We look at this is the beginning, this is the middle, this is the end. Where a lot of the Eastern perspective is really looking at the cycles, the cosmic cycles, the solar, the lunar cycles, even the cycles of civilization, the rise and fall of civilizations. And I think you made an important point in saying that nothing is random. Nothing is just some random thing that happens. It's all driven by data and energy. And I think that that's one way that I understand, say, the global, kind of economy and financial systems is that it's a representation of energy of similar to, the moon, cycles, and the tide comes in and out, that there's energy that drives all that movement of matter, that there's similar things that are also driving the movement of that within the kind of global economic ecosystem.
In the early 1900s, there was Professor Schumpeter, which was a genius, and he wrote about cycles, and he predicted also the crash of 1929. After 1929, Keynes came and says, well, if we take care of the money supply, et cetera, it will not happen again. So all politicians go with Keynes because if you tell politicians there's nothing you can do, why would you vote for them? So since then, we have the illusion that we're in charge of things, which we are not. I'll give you an example about the war cycle that maybe we'll come and talk about it later. About 10, 15 years ago, I warned that there would be a big war coming based on the cycle. Now, what does the cycle say? The cycle says that in the second decade of a new century, big wars start. So that's now. That's 100 years ago, the First World War. That's 200 years ago, Napoleon. That's 100 years before, it's called the Habsburg War. And if you're interested, if you Google major wars around the change of the century, you can go back 1,000 years, and every 100 years in the second decade of a century is a war. Now, that's crazy, right? And we can't explain that. But like people say, what do you do with cycles if they don't change? I says, well, after summer comes winter, and comes summer again, you can change it. But if you know the winter comes, you can buy a winter coat. So at least you can prepare yourself if you know what's coming. And right now we're in that situation that a lot of war cycles are pointing up. And we got exactly what I talked about 10, 15 years ago. So actually there's no free choice. It had to happen in one place or another place, but that's what we're dealing with right now.
And so maybe let's just go ahead and jump into the kind of war cycle topic first, then we get into the some of the financial aspects. So that makes sense. I mean, if you look at, you're right, like 1920s, 1820s, going back, it seems like that this was like 100-year cycle. It just kind of falls on that date. And so with the information that you're seeing, where do you see this war with Ukraine goes? Because while at the beginning it seemed like, okay, Russia is invading Ukraine, it seemed like it was more of a territorial dispute and it was very localized. It now feels like we've got United States, NATO versus Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Like it really feels like there's two world powers that are kind of building up that are at odds with each other. And it seems like it's
the same as happened in the Second World War. The parties are shaping up, but let's first go to how did we get in this situation? Because you don't hear much about that. I'm from Europe. We're a little bit more in European history than Americans. So when Gorbachev was breaking down the wall, there were still 500,000 Russian soldiers in the eastern of Poland and Germany. And the West made an agreement that they would not expand NATO or whatever it was at that time if Russia would withdraw. And Russia took the advice, and they took out 500,000 soldiers. One of them was Mr. Putin. He was then stationed over there, and he went back to Russia. Now, the problem is there came a certain doctrine which is called the doctrine of Brzezinski. I don't know if you remember him. I think he was the advisor of Carter. And he says we have to expand to get rid of the influence of Russia. At the time of Putin, they wanted to have a Euro-Russian combination. They wanted to work together with it. So then came, probably we know that then came the Minsk conference. And the Minsk conference, they decided that Ukraine is going to be, for the moment, is going to be neutral. 2 days after Mrs. Merkel from Germany, the president, minister president, retired, they asked her about it. She says, no, it was just to keep Putin quiet, because in the meantime, Kiev was trying to build up their war machine. And I know that Mr. Putin said, how do I know that? I was very close in those circles. Even if you go on my website, you maybe see that I was on Russian television together with President Putin years ago. So I have some information. And Mr. Putin says, I don't know why they're doing this to me. But it was the idea of Brzezinski that says, we're just going to push Russia all the way back. Now, all that Russia wants, according to me, and I still hear that, is don't come too close. And what I never hear in the United States is that, what did Kennedy do? He almost started World War III because there was some rockets in Cuba. So I guess, according to this doctrine, he was totally wrong. Because now, 100 kilometers from the Russian border, Biden and consort say we can put whatever we want over there. And if Russia says we don't want it that close, then it's Russia's fault. You never hear anything's going on over there. So now, and I say this totally neutral because I'm not an American. So now I hear that they say, well, soon then we have to bring over all the companies from the United States to rebuild Ukraine. Aha, now maybe you have an idea what's going on over there. Last thing, but not least, 4 weeks into the war of Ukraine, the President Erdogan set up a meeting between Russia and Kiev to start peace negotiations, and they were almost ready. And then came the Americans, and especially Mr. Boris, what's his name, from England at that time. And they says, no way, we're not going to have any peace. There's a lot going on over there. Now, what you said about people joining, we're going to be in for a big surprise, because from the middle of this year, that's already in a month or 2 months, more war cycles are going up. And I don't think anybody's prepared to what can happen. First of all, the Russians have this supersonic rocket system that the United States has no defense against. Then we have the Iranians who are almost ready. And I hear on the news, it says, well, we're dealing with the North Koreans who are nuclear. We'll deal with the Iranians also. The thing they don't understand is that Koreans still don't want to die. Iranians want to be martyrs. How do you deal with a system that doesn't matter if it goes under? I'm surprised that nobody's waking up. Now, on top of that, we have China, and we got Russia. So we got two parties like we had in the First World War, the Second World War, that's shaping up. And it's actually Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. I won't say the West doesn't have a chance, but actually I think the West has no chance. They're not prepared. The West thinks they can do whatever they want until somebody says is enough. And then I think the Americans are totally surprised. So even the American population doesn't really understand what's going on. And it's an amazing thing. So what I used to say is that at the end of civilizations, usually you have certain signs. When Rome was burning, the Senate sat for 3 weeks discussing if angels are feminine or masculine. You can look it up in the history books. it looks a little bit what's going over here. Here we're busy with in which toilet should we go? Men, general, I don't know what's going on over here. So this really is the end of a society. On top of that, we have the big deficit, which usually happens at the end of society. Because why is that usually the end of society? Because people want to live on a certain level, but they're not prepared to work that hard anymore. So now you have to throw around money in order to keep everybody happy, and that doesn't end well. So there is a lot of signs are going on that actually there's the end of the society of the United States coming on, with or without the war. But I am very, very worried about what's going on in the world.
So, looking back at ancient Rome, I'm sure they believed, oh, Rome will never fall. We're so big, we're so powerful, we'll never fall. And I would agree that I think America is in a similar place. And even a lot of people that you might bump into, you say, hey, are you concerned about the growing threat of China? Are you concerned about the dollar? Are you concerned about this? And a lot of people just, well, not really. They're just focused on their football or focused on their activities or, what the celebrities are doing. They're watching, TV, they're binge watching, things on Netflix, et cetera. Yet you're right, though, if you look into DC, the issues that I think are really, kind of frightening, like the central bank digital currency, the state of the dollar, and so many things like that, none of that's even being talked about. They're arguing over which bathrooms people can go into. And, it's really, it really does feel like that. So are you seeing the signs both from the cycles and also just the indicators? Are you seeing that we're at the end stage of the American empire?
Well, there are every empire, I can't say every empire, but as far as I studied, an empire usually lasts about 250 years. And if you see when this empire started, the United States, it's 250 years are over. So now on top of this, you got this BRIC situation where everybody now has this anti-dollar. And what happened was that when Nixon stopped with the gold standard, they actually went over to the crude oil standard and had an understanding with Saudi Arabia that the dollar is more or less connected to the crude oil. So now Saudi Arabia also wants to join the BRICS. Nothing is left. Nothing is left of this society of the United States like it was. Sorry. On top of that, there is a Kondratyev cycle. Kondratyev was an economist in the early 1900s in Russia who invented the Kondratyev cycle. And they killed him because he says capitalism is going to be stronger than communism. He couldn't say that. But that cycle shows that every 60, 70 years, a new continent takes over, is going to be the engine of the economy. And it started already. It's India, it's China, Singapore, Australia is over there. And the United States is just getting behind. Like I said, I'm from Europe, and I'm surprised that I thought that the United States was a very effective society, but things don't function anymore. Try to go to a bank, try to do something. For instance, I don't even know why there's so many banks in the streets, because if you look in Europe, there's almost no bank. Who needs a bank? You don't have to be physically going into a bank, but to see people standing in line in a bank. But that's normal, because if you start a new thing, then the one who were there before you gets outdated. So that happens, and I think a lot of things get outdated. I'm just very, very worried about this idea. You're American, so I don't want to say too much, but you maybe know United States was involved in 15 wars the last 100 years. And Russia was involved in one war. So the story that the Russians and whoever is over there, the Chinese, are the aggressors, it's all public relations, but people don't know that. And they're getting weaker and weaker, United States, and I don't think even they're going to defend Taiwan like Biden says we're going to defend Taiwan, because I don't know how they can go in the Chinese Sea and look at the back with Iran and Russia, and who knows what's doing. So I don't even why they say that. I think they still live in the 50s or the 60s. And I find it very worrisome that they continue to push Ukraine and Russia in a corner, and Russia now supported by Iran and China, and soon by North Korea, and nobody understands how dangerous the situation is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Now, you mentioned the BRICS nations and the dollar and the de-dollarization, and that's also one of the big things I think that not a lot of people are talking about, but that has very significant ramifications. And so, looking into the dollar and the fact that our dollar is worth what it's worth because it's the world reserve currency, it's the petrodollar status, et cetera. Yet if you look at China, especially China, really actively working to undo that and to de-dollarize the world. Do you think that we could see a collapse of the dollar, and what does that look like, and what kind of timeline would you expect with that?
Well, the cycle for this year still looks okay, but of course, we're going to have a collapse of the dollar. To give you an example, so I'm from Holland. If there is a treasury coming out, about 100% of the Dutch people buy the treasury from the government. I don't know how much it is over here, but here is more or less foreigners. If foreigners step back, you get a huge spike in interest rates, which you're going to get. So I don't know even how they're going to handle that, because a lot of debt is short term in the United States. The government has short term debt, so I don't even know how they're going to get out of it. Not even talking about the dollar that's going to get major in trouble. Who knows what's going to happen? You asked me what's going to happen. That's a fundamental question that I usually deal with. I only know what's going to happen, when it's going to happen. So this year is still okay, but the dollar is I won't say it's finished, but again, close to finished. And even if it holds up, the buying power of the dollar is like getting 10% less by the year.
Yeah, with the inflation, yeah, absolutely. And so, looking at the stock markets, what do you expect to see happening in the stock markets over the course of the remainder of this year?
Well, we have been out of stocks since what was it? Since a year and a half, and we're still zero stocks. And cycles are down into later this year, and especially now in March. We talk now in March. Together, March, April, we expect the market to really go down, but no tradable low until later this year. And then it's just going to hang around a little bit. But the good times are over. Well, it depends what good times are. I always say the Dow Jones was 5,000 when Clinton was there and the world was not ending. It still looked okay. So you can't say, that everything, but it's going to be difficult. So the cycles are down into October, November period, and then we expect a bounce. So we probably stay out of stocks until then. And when I have an interview, usually I tell people, if you go to my site, charlesnenner.com, you can get in there 4 weeks for free, because I like to have things black and white. I like people to read exactly what I say, because they listen, but they don't exactly remember which months I said what I said. So please go there and look for 4 weeks. If you like it, you can subscribe. You don't have to. At least you have an idea how we work with cycles and price targets, and how really the big investors on Wall Street approach markets.
And so when you say that the markets are going to kind of drop until around October and it bounces a little bit, what kind of drop are you thinking? Is that 10%, 20, 30, 40%? What are we expecting?
It could be 30, 40%.
So pretty
the
significant.
idea behind it is that the Fed funds will probably go much higher than people think. I'm surprised, and I'm talking like a fundamental analyst, I'm surprised that the Fed funds are now the highest since 2007, and there's an inverted yield curve, and it's like nothing is going on. We know history that these chances that we have a bad time is 90%. Nobody really talks about it. The interesting thing is, I remember in 2000, I was at Goldman Sachs, and I predicted the crash of 2000. And later on the television, years later, says, how could it be so stupid that we didn't think that there's a business cycle? So the idea of media is to be positive, to buy, because if you're negative, nobody watches you and you don't have any advertisements. So they continue to push and push and push until it's too late. And that's what's going to happen again.
And what do you see happening with silver and gold? Because I know that, silver a lot of times will follow gold. And if you look at gold, for instance, Russia backing the ruble with gold, it looks like, China has, similar plans. How do you see the role and the value of gold and silver changing?
Well, again, I don't have too much insight. What I can say, it's interesting that there's a war and there's inflation, and gold and silver don't go up. And they don't go up because cycles are down into May. So I'm expecting a real bull market, but you have to wait till May, June, and that's when it starts. Now, again, we had this example of IBM. Then probably in the consciousness of people comes what we already know, and that's why they say, let's buy gold and silver. Right now, they might say the war is not so serious, we don't have to buy it. And then even if nothing changes, they might say, oh, maybe it's more serious than I thought, let's buy gold and silver. We will read in the newspaper in May, June, when it starts, why it starts. But the bull market is going to continue.
I see, and that makes sense. That makes sense. It follows the psychology of it all. And so looking at, because I know in one of your recent interviews with Greg Hunter, you're talking about, as we get further into, say, around 2027, seeing a more of like a 1929 type, really kind of financial collapse, right? Is that what you can explain that a little bit, what you see there?
Yeah, I can explain. So what I said in when we talked in the opening, there are long-term cycles and short-term cycles. Now, long-term cycles are yearly cycles. And that means is if somebody looks at a chart, then every bar is not a day, but every bar is a year. And all these cycles stop in 2027. And they look exactly the same as in 1929. Don't ask me why it is. Could be a war, could be something else. The only thing that we could breathe lighter is that if we look for a big war, it's probably not going to happen until 2027 when we have the huge crash. So that's something positive we can take out of it. But that's really going to be a major, major crash like in the 29th period.
And if you're looking at all this and kind of piecing it all together, and the people I've talked to, like Martin Armstrong or others that have said very similar things, I find that that it seems like the principles that are driving your analysis of the cycle are almost universal, in that people that have the intelligence, they can see these same patterns emerging and draw similar conclusions, which I think is really, when you have multiple people that all line up on the same thing, it's very telling. And so, well, it looks like, what we're seeing, I mean, this isn't the 90s anymore. It's not the 2000s, early 2000s anymore, where, the world is a pretty beautiful, stable place. Of course, there's the ups and downs. I mean, it really feels like we're entering into a very difficult period, because if we're talking about, even if the stock market goes down 30, 35, 40% this year, and then kind of go, bobbles around until, something more significant in 27, with the war continuing, with the, kind of what you're talking about of the end of the American empire as we know it. And these are all very significant changes. I mean, this is, life as we know it here in America, fundamentally changing across this process. So do you think that the whole world is kind of entering into a very difficult period over the next, say, decade?
It's going to be a very terrible period, but don't think that information will stop or help. I'll give you an example. When I was a medical doctor, you have a patient that's dying of lung cancer, and his family standing around his bed visiting, and they says, let me go out because I want to have a cigarette outside. So there's something. Professor Kahneman that wrote, they got the Nobel Prize for the book of slow thinking and fast thinking. He explains that there is a short-term consequence and long-term consequence, and the short-term consequence with people takes over the long-term consequence. So even if we know these things, Emotionally, I don't see anything can save us.
Yeah, when you look at it, because I've been trying to really kind of wrap my head around these things as well. And we have people talking about the Great Reset and all these different big changes. And, the more I've researched and dug into it, the more I've realized that these cycles are not something even man can control. And you see a lot of these
No.
big power brokers and these elites that it seems like they're trying to take control, during these cycles and these changes. But fundamentally, like the cycles are so much bigger than what we can even fathom. And so, but looking at a cycle, right? What goes up must come down, and what goes down must come up. Like it's the way that things always balance out in a cyclical system. And so, if we're entering this period where we're seeing, in many ways, the collapse of a lot of this current system, right? This, this kind of unipolar world, led by America, that's very Americentric. It's shifting, and that's very significant. That the ramifications of what happens if, say, America does, fall, that will send ripples across every part of this whole world. But on the other side of this, like it feels like we're entering into the end, but the end is also the beginning, right? And the down part of a cycle is also the beginning part of the up part of the cycle. So, do you foresee?
Well, when Rome went under, it never came back. It's not so easy. Societies go under and they don't come back anymore.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I guess, and I guess I can't say I expected America would either, from many ways of looking at it. But in terms of the overall kind of world system, I mean, after, say, the next, and this is a kind of more of a far-reaching question, but it's a curious conversation to have. Is, let's say, after, say, we get to, say, 2030, 2031, 32, after that, and do you see that the next stage of humanity will be kind of different? Will we have some good things happening, some rebuilding? I mean, what does the cycle kind of show you after that stage?
Well, you asked for it, and I hope that your listeners can sleep after this. So let's take a chart of IBM. IBM has a price and a time. We, on the war cycle, we have a price and a time. And I'm sorry to say, I've said it before, and I hope people can sleep. It shows that 35% of mankind is not going to survive. What it looks after that, I really don't know. I really don't know.
So these are some very significant changes that we're entering into. I mean, it's a lot to kind of grasp. It's pretty heavy.
But there's not much I
information.
I give you another example. When I was at Goldman Sachs in 2000, the market started coming down. I got a phone call from the White House. I hang up. I says, guys, stop fooling around. I thought that my partners are making fun of me. 5 times they called, and 5 times I hang up, until, maybe you remember, Abby Cohen was then one of the big people at Goldman Sachs. Says they called me, and I says, go to Mr. Nenner because he knows more about timing. I showed him that the NASDAQ market will go down 80%. Nobody listened. So there's not much you can do. It's just a sad situation. It's like in Europe, they ask me, because I'm now in Miami and I'm sometimes here. They says, the Americans really didn't have anybody better than Biden to become president. I don't know what to say. And then they say, who's actually in charge? Because one time he wanted to go to a place, I don't remember, and then the new lady that is the press officer now says, we will not let him go. So everybody says, who is we? So nobody knows who's in charge of this business. Biden seems to be the best person in the United States to rule the country. So the Europeans have not such a great opinion of what the United States is doing. And they fear for the worst.
Yeah, that's my opinion also. It's like, what's this government doing? I mean, it seems like
And who's in charge?
Yeah, exactly. It's not Biden, certainly. So it's like, who's who's in his ear? Is it Obama? Is it, I mean, what a number of people. So what, another thing that I wanted to ask you about is just the overall, the rates, right? So do you expect to see a continued, hike from the Fed? Because what we're seeing now is that we're seeing, look, my wife and I, we bought a house about 2 years ago, and we bought a house at like 3.5%, and I feel like it was just such a wonderful thing to be able to sign at that time. But now people, if it's at 6-7%, they can only afford a house that's half the price, for the same amount of income as that what we got just from that rate increase. So it really, and that's just one area where we're seeing a massive kind of ripple effect, right? We're seeing that the new house purchases are reaching all-time lows. So do you expect them to continue to raise rates? And what do you expect to see happening with inflation simultaneously?
Well, first of all, the Fed's funds go up until late 2024. That's what the cycle says. Second of all, I think I have it on a website, but whoever has a chart, most people don't have it of the last 100, 150 years on the long yield, sees that every 30 years, there's a low. And we have hit a low, and now we're up for 30 years, having higher rates. We go back to the 80s, like 16, 17, 18%. The inflation goes in waves, like stocks goes in waves. And we have seen the first wave, and now we're hanging around until we continue later this year, and inflation is going to be a big problem. But interest rates are going much higher. It's going to be difficult to manage.
Wow. So you see, potentially rates going back to what they were in the 80s. We're talking double digits.
But it can take 30 years.
I see, to get there.
It's a 30-year cycle.
I see. But it's in that 30-year cycle, it's not like, it goes up to say 7% and it drops back down. So it just is a slow climb towards that. Is that right?
That's correct. It's a slow climb. It can take years, but we have seen the low. You're not going to see 2-3% anymore.
I see. For people that are, understand this information and are willing to face the facts, right? Because I think for a lot of people, look, I talk to a lot of folks and I have some of these conversations and their brain kind of shuts off. It's like, I don't want to think about that, right? It's like, oh, okay, that's okay, right? And so we'll talk about something else. But for people that understand all of this and they know what's happening, what advice would you give them for people that are trying to protect themselves and to navigate these turbulent waters ahead of us?
Well, in 2006, you can look it up also on my website on CNBC. I said this is a top in the housing market. And what did we do for the big institutions? We went short or by put options on the home builders. So you don't have to sit just idle and say, oh, my house is going to lose 50%. You can go short or buy long-term puts on the like Nenner or Toll Brothers. If you watch our research, we tell you when to go short, and then you make the money on the downside in the financial markets that you lose on your house. So there are ways to protect yourself. It's like most insiders do that, most institutions. You have to be part of the knowledge of the institutions and not listen to the media, which is difficult. They always send you in the wrong direction. And then you can save yourself. You don't have to get in trouble.
But so it sounds like that, you mentioned before that you have zero in stocks. So stocks at this time in history are not something that you'd recommend for people.
No, and I know some stocks go up and people get enthusiastic. We're just not good enough to find that one or two stocks that go up against the whole market. The people say I'm a stock picker and I can find the stocks that go up against the rest of the market, but we don't try to figure that out.
Yeah, it seems like just trying to pick the winning horse out of 1,000 horses.
You have 1 second? One?
Sure.
Okay. My wife just mentioned that. Anyway, he can look at it. Since the market is down, we just covered the short with Apple. We're up 10, 12% on the short sale. So that's what we do. But we don't intend to go long when the whole direction of the market is down.
Ah, I see. Okay. Well, that's interesting. Well, Dr. Nenner, I know that you have another appointment. I appreciate the time that you've given us so far. I'll pull your website up one more time for folks that are watching. This is just charlesnenner.com, where people can learn more about you. They can access your services. They can, get in touch with you, et cetera. So I recommend people definitely checking that out. And do you have any kind of closing thoughts for the audience?
No, what my closing thoughts are that try to understand how the insiders are approaching markets by watching us for free for 4 weeks. And even late, you don't find it interesting, at least you get a feel of what is really going on under the disguise of the news. It gives you a whole different perspective. And if you like it, you can continue and subscribe. But in this time, especially because I think the market now comes down in March, April, maybe it's worthwhile for the next 4 weeks to watch what's going on.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be certainly an eventful year ahead of us. So, Dr. Nenner, thank you very much for joining us today. I was looking forward to this interview, and I hope we can do this again. But I really appreciate you taking the time.
You're welcome. We'll do it again.